So I think most of you possibly do know me, but for those of you who don't, so I'm a medical oncologist. We've had a talk from a surgical team, and we've talked about radiation. So surgery and radiation are pretty much, you will really consider those as treatments for localized disease. And as a medical oncologist, so I don't deal with surgery or radiation side, so my sort of area is drug therapies and research. And drug therapies and research are they really fit primarily in the area of recurrent or metastatic disease, so disease that has come back after surgery or spread somewhere else, or if it's inoperable to start with, so locally advanced disease. So pretty much all of my patients are in this situation. Before I talk about what we're doing from a sort of clinical perspective, just to give you maybe a step back about how do we make things better. So the 8th aim of the charity is to, the wording we've used is to support the development of standard drug treatments. And the reason we've used that wording is we need these drugs to be not only discovered to be effective, but to be licensed in this indication and reimbursed, funded through the NHS. Then we can use them. So not just discovering an idea that this might work or even seeing some evidence that it works, but actually getting it available for patients. So that's what we really need, that endpoint. And if we take a step back, because I know we've had a lot of conversation about one particular type of salivary gland cancer, adenoid cystic carcinoma, but actually, as we've said, there's over 20 different what we call histologies, so the way they look under the microscope, and then each one of those you can actually break them down again and again and again. So you could argue there's over 100 types of salivary gland cancer if you break each into 4, and pathologists will routinely break each into 2, high grade or not high grade. So you've immediately doubled it, and then you look at all of these other ways of classifying it. So there's there are so many different types of patient. So when we've got some evidence for some patients with salivary gland cancer that treatments do work. The evidence might not be 500 patients randomized study, but we've got evidence that I think clinicians will interpret as this drug is effective in this patient population. The challenge we have is it isn't licensed or reimbursed. So that's the first thing. How do we get that through? And I think that's where we as a charity, and that was the question I asked Josh Fenton-Glynn one of the questions I asked him this morning, but we have to advocate for how we get access to those drugs through the healthcare system, because there's a huge inequality globally. So some bits of the world people can access it. That same equality sits within this country. If people can afford tens of thousands of pounds or hundreds of thousands of pounds, they can pay for these drugs themselves. So one question is, how do we advocate for drugs to be licensed and reimbursed through the NHS? But the next question is, how do we build the evidence base to get to that point? And so that's really what what I see my job as. And so that's all through research, really. And there's 3 different types broadly that you can look at it. You've got clinical research, what we call translational, and then basic laboratory research. So clinical research is the clinical trials. So when you get patients and you've got a treatment and you give the treatment to the patients and measure what happens. Translational, well, if I go to the other end of the spectrum, the basic science is when you've got scientists, PhD students, clinicians or scientists in a lab studying the disease so they can understand more about it, so they can work out what is driving this disease and what are potential drug options. And then you've got the bit in the middle that we call translational research. So you get stuff from the patients and study it in the lab. And so, we get, anyone who's spoken to me or our team at the Christie knows we ask if they'll consent to our biobank research, and a big part of that is we're calling in their tumour samples and then sending them to our academic pathologists or to people in the lab who are looking at these tumour samples. And so I won't really go into any detail about what we're doing here, but in Manchester, we are doing all 3 of these. The biggest challenge, as our 2 speakers have just alluded to, is the clinical trials, because they are so expensive. Pharmaceutical industry don't really invest in these rare cancers. And we're competing against, it's on the one hand, when we say maybe up to 50% of cancers are rare cancers, so let's focus on them, that's good, but that just shows you we're competing with all these other rare cancers to get this funding then for our one study. So it's really challenging to get what is often hundreds of thousands of pounds needed to run even a 20 patient study might cost you £500,000 £100, and then you've also got to get the drug provided to you as well. So we're doing all three in Manchester. You know, at the moment we've got 2 PhD students. Sam, who's gone home, but he's just started his PhD. Sian started her PhD almost 12 months ago. So we have a surgeon and a medical oncologist, both doing a PhD. Sian's taking actual fresh tumour samples from the patients who are operated on at Manchester University hospitals and then taking them literally across the road into the lab. And she's working with Z, who's sat next to her, who's a postdoctoral researcher. She's already got her PhD, and they're doing all these clever things in the lab, looking at different protein signatures, different immune cell signatures, looking at different immune populations with the question, my question is, what is the difference about the immune system in this disease that means our standard immunotherapies don't work? Because the standard immunotherapies have been tested across salivary gland cancers, and of the 23 or even 100 different types that we look at, there probably is a signal in 1 or 2 types of salivary cancers that immunotherapy might help, but in most, and particularly in adenoid cystic, which is the most frequently recurrent, that signal isn't there. So the question is, how does it differ from other cancers where immunotherapies work? And the reason we're asking that is, when we know how it differs, well, what is the mechanism that we can drug in this disease then? You know, and if you then look back to pharmaceutical companies, they're developing a whole load of different immunotherapies that work in different ways, but they aren't asking this question. So we have to ask the question to get this answer, to look to them and find out what drugs are there that are available, that we can then look to funders like whoever, Cancer Research UK or Salivary Gland Cancer UK, when we've raised £1 million or whoever, and say, look, we've got this evidence that this drug should work in this patient group, now we have to run the trial. But it's a huge amount of work. So that's just a quick overview of what we're doing in Manchester. What my ambition is through Salivary Gland Cancer UK, really we need sort of 2 or 3 centres in the UK that are all doing exactly the same, but not quite exactly the same. So they have the same setup, but they're asking different but complementary questions. So we're all kind of working together. And it has to then feed into what's happening in other centres. So if you look globally, you know, there's in the US, as always, you know, they have loads more money that goes into research. So there is more research happening. But what we do in Manchester and through Salivary Gland Cancer UK is where we link up with the major US centres who are also researching salivary gland cancers to make sure that any research we're doing feeds into what they're doing. So for instance, Guy's looked at almost 200 patients of adenoid cystic carcinoma for a particular marker, P63. The group in MD Anderson are pulling together a global cohort, of which ours is probably the biggest contributor, I think. We'll see how many they've put in as well, but it's probably similar to the US cohort. But the MD Anderson are actually pulling together another half a dozen groups from around the world. So we feed our data into other analyses that are going on around the world. And that's, you know, how it should be, because then it's one research effort. You can't compete against each other when you've got such a tiny patient population. It's wasteful for us to be running the same studies in different labs or different hospitals, either in the same country or other countries. So that's the other ambition, really, through Salivary Gland Cancer UK, is to make sure what we're doing in Manchester and then across the UK is coordinated to what's happening at other centres. And that is the quickest way, definitely, to make a difference to people like Alex and Shane and other people in this room. So I will end there. So thank you. I can take questions.